You're listening to Trace Hunt Radio. We explore the darkest chapters of true crime, unsolved mysteries, cold cases, and the twisted minds behind them. Follow the blood, chase the clues, uncover the truth. Stay sharp. The hunt begins now.
Deep in the forests of Hollow Creek, hunters once whispered about shadows that moved when no one should be there. Locals spoke of strange howls echoing through the trees and the unnerving feeling of being watched. For years, those warnings were dismissed as folklore, tales to scare children away from wandering too far into the woods. But the truth waiting beneath the trees was far more horrifying than any campfire story. When authorities were called to investigate a long-abandoned hunting cabin on the edge of the creek, they expected nothing more than vandalism or trespassers. Instead, what they uncovered chilled even the most seasoned investigators. Inside the cabin were tools, not for hunting deer or trapping animals, but for skinning, preserving, and displaying human remains. What lay hidden in that cabin exposed a brutal predator who had turned the wilderness into his private hunting ground. The man responsible would come to be known only as the Skinner of Hollow Creek, a name that sent shivers through every home in the county. This wasn't just murder. It was methodical, ritualistic, and designed to erase the humanity of his victims. Tonight, we take you deep into the woods, inside the cabin, and into the mind of one of the most disturbing killers ever uncovered. The woods around Hollow Creek stretched for miles, dense thickets of pine, tangled undergrowth, and narrow trails that seemed to twist back on themselves. Hunters and hikers knew the terrain well enough to respect it. Stray too far, and you could lose daylight in minutes. At the farthest edge of the forest, where the creek bent around jagged rocks and faded into a swampy marsh, sat an old hunting cabin. Built in the 1940s, it had been abandoned for decades, its roof sagging, boards rotting, windows shattered by storms. Locals avoided it, not because of its disrepair, but because of the stories. For years, the cabin had been the subject of campfire whispers. Strange noises at night, lantern light flickering through broken panes, animals found mutilated nearby. Most people dismissed these tales as folklore, the natural way small towns build legends to keep children from wandering too deep into the forest. But in the summer of 2007, those stories became something darker. The call. Sheriff's deputies received a call from a group of hikers who had stumbled across the cabin. They hadn't gone inside, the smell alone had sent them running, but they reported hearing the buzzing of flies and seeing stains on the floorboards through the open door. At first, authorities suspected it might be an illegal poacher's den, perhaps a dumping ground for game left to rot. When deputies arrived, the first thing they noticed was the silence. No birdsong, no rustling wildlife. Just the heavy stillness of summer air, thick with decay. The closer they came to the cabin, the stronger the stench became. Not the sweet rot of deer carcasses, but something sharper, something that clawed at the back of the throat. The first look inside. Deputy Carson was the first to step through the door. His flashlight cut across the interior, peeling wallpaper, a rusted stove, collapsed chairs. But then the beam caught on something else. Hooks suspended from the ceiling, thick ropes stained dark, and a wooden table scarred with deep cuts. The floor was slick in places, blackened with old stains that no storm could wash away. At first, Carson thought it was an animal slaughterhouse, some old butcher's setup. But then he saw the wall. Nailed to the boards, Stretched flat as though displayed were strips of skin. Some tanned, others raw, all unmistakably human. Carson staggered back into the sunlight, retching into the dirt. His partner radioed for backup, her voice shaking. Within hours, the cabin was sealed with crime scene tape, and the Hollow Creek Sheriff's Department realized they had uncovered something far worse than an old hunting den. Catalog of horror. Crime scene technicians worked through the night, documenting every inch of the cabin. They found knives of varying sizes, their handles worn smooth, blades stained with residue, jars filled with unknown liquids, some containing tissue samples preserved like grotesque specimens, ledger books, written in cramped handwriting, listing dates and cryptic notes, harvested, prepared, displayed, bones buried shallowly behind the cabin, unearthed by cadaver dogs, stripped clean but not by animals. The evidence was clear. This was no one-time crime scene. It was a workshop, a ritual space. Someone had used this cabin for years, maybe decades, turning it into their own private theater of brutality. The legend made flesh. When the news broke, locals were stunned but not entirely surprised. The whispers about Hollow Creek, about strange disappearances in the woods, suddenly had a face. People remembered hikers who had vanished without a trace, hunters who went missing during deer season, runaways never seen again. Now those memories collided with the reality of what the cabin revealed. The stories weren't warnings spun from imagination. They were echoes of truth, buried under years of silence. And the man responsible, whoever he was, had earned his name in blood. The Skinner of Hollow Creek. Long before deputies stepped into the cabin, before crime scene tape fluttered in the forest breeze, people had already begun disappearing in the woods around Hollow Creek. At the time, each case was treated as an isolated tragedy. A hiker who strayed too far, a runaway who never came home, a hunter who didn't return before dusk. But looking back, the pattern is chillingly clear. 1979, the missing hunter. The first name whispered in connection to Hollow Creek was Robert Langley, a 42-year-old hunter known in town as a skilled outdoorsman. One October weekend, he went into the woods to track deer. When he didn't return, a search party combed the trails for days. They found his rifle leaning against a tree, his pack half buried in leaves. But Robert himself was gone. The case was chalked up to an accident. Perhaps he slipped into the creek and drowned, or got lost deeper in the forest. His wife insisted he knew those woods too well for that. Something happened out there, she told reporters. Robert wouldn't just vanish. Her words were dismissed as grief. 1983, the runaway who didn't run. 4 years later, a teenager named Melissa Harris disappeared. 17 years old, she was last seen walking home after a shift at a diner. Police labeled her a runaway within days, pointing to her troubled home life as explanation. But Melissa had left her purse, her money, and her diary behind. Her best friend recalled Melissa being uneasy in the weeks before she vanished. She said someone was watching her, following her near the woods when she walked home. The comment was brushed off until her case file was later pulled from storage after the cabin was discovered. 1989. The fisherman at the creek. By the late 80s, Hollow Creek was whispered about among locals as bad luck ground. That reputation deepened when Earl Simmons, a retired factory worker, vanished while fishing. His tackle box was found at the water's edge, its contents neatly arranged as though set down intentionally. What made Earl's disappearance particularly haunting was the single boot discovered half buried in mud nearby. It wasn't torn, it wasn't dragged, it was placed, as though someone had deliberately left it there. No body was ever recovered. The overlooked pattern. By the early 1990s, at least 6 people had gone missing within a 5-mile radius of Hollow Creek. But in a rural community, disappearances were often explained away. Hunting accidents, drownings, young people leaving town for bigger cities. Each case stood alone in official records. The Skinner's genius, or his cruelty, was in choosing victims who could be dismissed by circumstance. Men who ventured into the woods alone. Women whose troubled lives made them easy to label as runaways. Travelers with no strong ties to the town. The families' pleas. For the families left behind, the frustration was unbearable. Melissa Harris's mother campaigned for years, writing letters to state police demanding they reopen her daughter's case. She was told there was no evidence of foul play. Robert Langley's son, who grew up without answers, later said, "They told us he probably got lost. My father had hunted those woods since he was a boy. He didn't get lost. Someone took him." These voices were drowned out at the time, overshadowed by the desire to keep Hollow Creek's reputation intact. 1995, the campers' discovery. In the summer of 1995, a group of campers claimed they stumbled upon something near the cabin. They said they saw stretched animal hides nailed to the wall outside and tools scattered around. Frightened, they ran back to town. Local authorities checked the site but found nothing unusual. At least, nothing they documented. Years later, when investigators returned after the cabin's true discovery, they wondered if those campers had actually seen the earliest evidence of human remains. The Skinners' silence. Through the late 90s and early 2000s, the disappearances continued sporadically. Each time the explanation was the same: an accident, a runaway, a transient soul who wandered too close to Hollow Creek. No one connected the cases because no one wanted to believe a predator was operating in their woods. But in Harold's, the Skinners' ledger books later found in the cabin, the dates matched almost perfectly. Each cryptic note of harvested or prepared lined up with the very nights these men, women, and children were last seen. Legacy of the early victims. When their names were finally read aloud at vigils decades later, the families wept with equal parts sorrow and fury. They had been right all along. Their loved ones had not wandered. They had not abandoned their homes. They had been hunted, skinned, and turned into artifacts in a predator's collection. What haunted investigators most was that these early cases could have stopped him. If just one disappearance had been investigated more thoroughly, if just one family's pleas had been taken seriously, the Skinner of Hollow Creek might never have had decades to refine his brutality. Predators leave patterns, and Harold Cramer, now known only as the Skinner of Hollow Creek, had honed his to perfection. By the time authorities pieced together his journals and the evidence in his cabin, a chilling picture emerged of how he hunted, how he lured, and how he vanished back into the trees unseen. The perfect hunting ground. Hollow Creek was an ideal setting for a predator. The forest stretched for miles with few trails officially marked, its thick canopy blotting out the moonlight and muffling sound. Campers often joked about how quickly night fell in the woods, but for the Skinner, that was no joke. It was his cover. Deputies later mapped out the disappearances and found almost all victims vanished near choke points, bends in the trail, narrow bridges, or marshy crossings where travelers slowed. These were ambush zones, chosen with precision. He didn't strike randomly. He studied the land as if it were a trap he had designed himself. The Watcher. Witnesses later recalled moments that now seem sinister. Joggers had felt eyes on them when running along the creek path. Hunters had noticed movement in the tree line, but when they turned, they saw nothing but branches. One hiker remembered stopping at dusk to tie his boot. When I looked up, he told investigators, I saw a man halfway down the ridge, just standing there staring. I thought he was another hiker, but he never moved, never called out. When I blinked, he was gone. These stories, ignored at the time, were the shadows of the Skinner's surveillance. He was patient. He waited. He stalked. The lures. In some cases, victims may have been coaxed rather than dragged. Among the journals, investigators found references to the gift and the voice. Forensic psychologists speculated he may have used small lures, a dropped wallet, a child's toy, or even calling out as if in distress. Several victims were last seen stopping to help or investigate something unusual. Elaine Matthews, the waitress who disappeared in 1999, was found to have left her shift with no sign of struggle, suggesting she willingly paused before being taken. The Skinner was not just a hunter. He was a manipulator, able to pull his prey toward him under the guise of help. Tools of the trade. The cabin's arsenal confirmed how deliberate his methods were. Ropes were cut to precise lengths, hooks mounted exactly where beams could hold weight, knives sharpened to surgical edges. Nothing was improvised. Forensic analysis showed the ropes bore frays from repeated tightening, suggesting multiple victims had been restrained in the same places. Soil samples from spades and buckets tied the cabin to shallow graves found within a mile radius. He didn't rely on chance. He carried everything he needed to turn a simple abduction into a ritual execution. The ledger of death. Perhaps the most chilling window into his methods were the ledger books. Each entry was written like a scientist's log. Female, late 20s, acquired at Ridge, harvested, prepared, 2 HRs. The male, teen, fairground route, secured, displayed. Female, 30s, diner shift, approached willingly. There was no mention of names, no sign of humanity, just sterile notations of time, place, and procedure. For Harold, these weren't people. They were entries, specimens, pages in his archive, silence as his ally. The Skinner's greatest weapon wasn't just his knives or his cabin, it was silence. Rural communities often avoid confrontation, dismissing oddities as harmless. When hikers vanished, people said they got lost. When teens disappeared, people said they ran away. This culture of dismissal allowed him to operate for decades. He thrived not because he was invisible, but because people refused to believe he was there at all. A predator in plain sight. When investigators dug deeper into Harold's past, they found no history of violence, no arrests, no dramatic outbursts. He had worked quietly, paid bills, kept to himself. He wasn't the caricature of a monster. He was ordinary. Neighbors remembered him fixing his fence, buying groceries, nodding politely. No one suspected the man who smiled thinly at the hardware store was the same man who, hours later, would drag another victim into the woods. That ordinariness was his camouflage. He was not the man in the shadows of Hollow Creek. He was the man walking past you in daylight, blending seamlessly into the world. The predator's pattern. By combining the journals, evidence, and victim timelines, profilers reconstructed the Skinner's method. Observation. Stalking isolated areas for potential victims. Approach. Using lures or ambush zones to draw them in. Control. Ropes, hooks, and tools to restrain and silence. Ritual. Skinning, preserving, displaying. Cataloging. Recording each act with chilling detachment. The cycle repeated again and again, each time refined. Into the shadows. The Skinner didn't just live in the shadows. He became them. By the time deputies finally stepped into the cabin, he had perfected his craft so thoroughly that the forest itself seemed shaped by his hands. Every trail, every clearing, every cabin beam was part of a stage he had built for murder. It was only by pulling back the curtain, exposing the journals, the tools, the bones, that investigators finally began to understand the monster who had thrived in silence for nearly 3 decades. Among all the horrors in the Hollow Creek cabin, the hooks, the ropes, the preserved skin, nothing chilled investigators more than the stack of journals neatly arranged on a desk in the corner. Bound in cracked leather and worn from decades of use, they were not diaries in the usual sense. There were no rambling thoughts, no confessions of guilt or fear. Instead, they were cold, methodical, and precise. The journals were Harold Cramer's legacy, the ledger of death. First impressions. The first book, dated 1976, began not with words, but with sketches. Rough outlines of deer and rabbits, each marked with notes about skinning and preservation techniques. At first glance, it seemed like the log of a hunter, but soon the drawings shifted. By the third entry, the outlines were unmistakably human. Arms and legs marked with dotted lines, annotations about stretch length and display surface. The handwriting was neat, uniform, almost clinical. There were no flourishes, no personal touches. Every word was functional. Language of a collector. Investigators quickly noticed the terminology. Victims were never called by name. Instead, they were reduced to categories. Female, approx, 20s, Quarry Ridge, or male, teen, fairground path. The verbs were equally detached. Acquired, secured, harvested, prepared, displayed. It was the language of a collector cataloging items, not a killer reflecting on human lives. This was not passion. It was procedure. Cryptic codes. Some entries included abbreviations investigators initially struggled to interpret. SP appeared often, later understood as skin prepared. DS was believed to mean display surface. NR, not recovered. There were also numbers, likely time notations. SP 2.5 suggested the time taken for preparation. Each entry read like a scientist's experiment log, reducing murder to a formula, linking ledger to victims. The turning point came when detectives cross-referenced dates in the journals with local missing persons reports. The match was uncanny. October 1979. Male, 40s, Quarry, acquired, SP. This lined up with the disappearance of Robert Langley, the hunter whose rifle had been found abandoned. June 1983. Female, teen, bus stop, secured, NR. This corresponded to Melissa Harris, the 17-year-old waitress labeled a runaway. May 1989. Male, 60s, Creek Edge, acquired, shoe placed. This directly matched Earl Simmons, the fisherman whose single boot had been found in the mud. The ledger wasn't just a record. It was a map of the Skinners' killings. The victims without names. Most entries never included identifiers. Some were as vague as F-20's Ridge Path. This vagueness haunted investigators, as it meant there were likely more victims than they could ever confirm. Families of missing persons flooded the sheriff's office, each desperate to know if their loved one was among the anonymous codes. One particularly disturbing entry, dated 1991, read, M12 Fairground, secured quickly, display incomplete. Detectives linked this to a boy who disappeared from the county fair that summer, but his remains were never found. The ledger as ritual. Forensic psychologists studying the journals noted how the entries grew longer over time. Early notations were short, sometimes no more than a line. By the 1990s, Harold had begun writing paragraphs, descriptions of posture, the condition of skin, even weather conditions. One entry read, F, late 20s, diner shift, approached willingly, secured without resistance, harvested at 0195, displayed under lantern. SP3 is not disturbed. The chilling detail wasn't just in the act, but in the pride of the process. The Skinner wasn't merely documenting. He was reliving each act through writing, ensuring nothing was forgotten. A collector's mindset. To Harold, these journals were not confessions, but trophies in their own right. Just as he preserved skin and objects, he preserved memory through meticulous records. Each ledger was proof of his control, a way to ensure that even if bodies decayed, the details of his work would live on. One profiler remarked, "Most killers collect physical trophies. He collected memory." The journals show us not what he felt, but what he needed. Permanence. The final entries. The last dated entry in the journals was from 2003. F, mid-20s. Ridge, watched alone. Bag secured. SP incomplete. That same year, a woman named Marissa Cole vanished after leaving a party near Hollow Creek. Her eyeglasses, later found in the cabin, matched the entry. But the note incomplete suggested she may have escaped mid-process, or that Harold was interrupted. She was never found. After 2003, the entries stopped. Whether Harold grew too old, too cautious, or too weak to continue remains unknown. But for investigators, the silence of the ledger was as haunting as its words. What the ledger meant. To law enforcement, the journals transformed the Skinner from a rumor into undeniable reality. They linked his private horrors to real families, real names, and real grief. To the town, they were proof that Hollow Creek's darkest whispers had been true all along. And to the victims' families, they were both blessing and curse. The ledger offered answers, but in the coldest, most dehumanizing form imaginable. Their loved ones had been reduced to entries in a madman's catalog, immortalized not as people, but as processes. The ledger of death was not simply evidence. It was the Skinner's voice, his testimony, and his confession, written not in remorse, but in pride. Once the cabin was secured and the ledgers deciphered, investigators turned to the forest itself. If Harold Cramer had truly operated in these woods for decades, then the earth beneath Hollow Creek would hold the truth of his crimes. What followed was one of the largest forensic excavations the county had ever seen. The search begins. Cadaver dogs were the first to lead the way. Teams fanned out from the cabin, moving in grids, marking any place where the dogs alerted. Within the first week, they flagged over a dozen sites, shallow depressions in the earth, patches where vegetation grew unevenly, spots that looked too freshly disturbed for woods untouched in decades. At one such site, not 50 yards from the cabin, the soil was darker, looser. When the forensic team began to dig, the metallic snap of a shovel striking bone silenced everyone. What they unearthed that day was the first of many skeletons. The first grave. The remains were fragile, but complete. A female, mid-20s, with her wrists bound by frayed rope still preserved in the dirt. The positioning of the bones suggested she had been buried hastily, knees bent, one arm twisted unnaturally behind her back. Around her neck was a tarnished chain with a small locket, the kind of personal detail that would later help confirm her identity. She was believed to be Melissa Harris, the teenager dismissed as a runaway in 1983. For her mother, who had fought for decades to prove Melissa hadn't left willingly. The discovery was both vindication and heartbreak. The quarry graves. Beyond the cabin, the old quarry proved to be a mass graveyard. When investigators descended into its crumbling slopes, they uncovered layer after layer of remains. Some had been scattered by animals, others were remarkably intact. Forensic teams worked day and night, cataloging each find. They uncovered fragments of children's bones, believed to match the boy who vanished from the county fair in 1991. A skull with a healed fracture, later linked to a missing woman known to have suffered a facial injury years before. Bundles of bones wrapped in burlap, suggesting Harold had once transported remains before discarding them. Every bone told a story of violence. Every fragment confirmed that the Skinners' hunting ground was littered with lives stolen and discarded. Forensic challenges, decades underground, had taken their toll. Many remains were reduced to fragments, teeth, or small bones. Forensic anthropologists painstakingly pieced them together, like assembling grotesque puzzles. DNA testing provided some matches, but many victims remained unidentified. Dr. Adrian Vega, the forensic pathologist leading the team, described it plainly. "This forest is a graveyard. We may never know how many are here. Every time we dig, we find more." The ritual burials. What struck investigators was the inconsistency. Some victims were tossed haphazardly into shallow graves, left exposed to scavengers. Others were buried with precision, posed with care, as though Harold had staged them even in death. In one grave, a victim's arms were crossed neatly over her chest, her hair still tied with a ribbon. In another, a child's skeleton had been placed inside a wooden crate, as if displayed before burial. This duality suggested a chilling truth. Sometimes Harold discarded his victims like waste. Other times he treated them as prized specimens. His cruelty was not only in killing, but in deciding who was worthy of display. A town watches in horror. As word spread, families gathered at the edges of the excavation sites, hoping, dreading. Some clutched old photographs, desperate for confirmation. Others wept openly as remains were carried out in body bags. For many, the sight of bones emerging from the earth shattered decades of denial. The forest they had walked, hunted, and camped in was not wilderness. It was a cemetery. The toll on investigators, even seasoned officers, broke under the weight of what they unearthed. Sheriff Danvers later admitted, "It wasn't the bones that got to me. It was the personal things. A bracelet, a pair of glasses, a child's sneaker. That's when you realize these aren't just skeletons. They were people who had families, dreams, lives." Counselors were brought in for the excavation teams. Some investigators later confessed they could never hike or fish again without imagining what might lie just beneath the soil. The count. By the time the search slowed, at least 15 distinct sets of remains had been recovered, spanning over 2 decades. The true number was likely higher, but the earth would never give up all its secrets. For prosecutors, this was enough to secure Harold's place as one of the most prolific killers in state history. For the families, it was both relief and renewed grief. The bones told stories long buried, but they also left questions that could never be answered. Who were the unnamed? How many more had been lost to Hollow Creek's soil? A graveyard uncovered. In the end, the woods themselves became evidence. Trails once walked by children now led past marked excavation sites. Hunters avoided the ridges, fearful of stumbling upon more remains. The earth of Hollow Creek had held its secrets for decades, but once disturbed, it gave them up in fragments. Bones that testified to cruelty, to ritual, to lives erased. And yet, even as the last shovels packed away, investigators knew they had only uncovered part of the story. The rest remained buried in silence, known only to the man who had written it down in his ledger of death. When the evidence from the cabin and the graves was laid bare, investigators knew they were dealing with more than a recluse who snapped. This was a man who had stalked, hunted, killed, and preserved his victims for decades without slipping into the light of suspicion. To understand how Harold Cramer became the Skinner of Hollow Creek, forensic psychologists and criminal profilers built a portrait, one drawn from his journals, his behavior, and the remains he left behind. Early life in the shadows. Harold was born in 1948, the second son of a quiet, working-class family in the Hollowbrook area. His father was a laborer, stern and often absent, while his mother struggled with illness. Neighbors remembered Harold as the boy who never played. While others fished or rode bikes, he sat alone at the creek's edge, carving sticks with a penknife. Teachers recalled his intelligence but noted his disturbing fixations. He wrote essays on taxidermy and decay, and once turned in a science project featuring the bones of small animals he claimed to have found. As an adult, he would say little about childhood, except to mention discipline from his father, a word he used with a strange pride. The roots of control and detachment were planted early. The janitor with keys to everything. In his 20s, Harold worked odd jobs until landing steady employment as a janitor for the county buildings. It was here he learned invisibility. He had access to hallways, evidence rooms, and police files, yet no one paid him attention. A janitor was background noise, a pair of hands sweeping floors while others lived their lives. Investigators later discovered this role gave Harold not only access to crime records, but also knowledge of police blind spots. He studied disappearances like a scholar, knowing which victims would be dismissed, which cases would fade away. Obsession with preservation. The journals revealed an obsession not with killing itself, but with preserving. The act of skinning, cataloging, and displaying was his true ritual. For Harold, victims were specimens, canvases for his compulsion to control. Forensic psychologist Dr. Linda Parson described it this way: most killers seek dominance in the act. Harold sought permanence after the act. Killing was the means. Preservation was the end. This explained the duality of his burials. Some victims were discarded, others were carefully posed. The difference wasn't who they were, but how much he valued what they left behind. Traits of a predator. By comparing Harold to other known killers, profilers identified traits that defined him. Patience. He could stalk a victim for days before striking. Control. His journals showed strict timing, preparation, and ritual. Detachment. Victims were never human to him, only entries or specimens. Camouflage. His ordinariness allowed him to blend in. No criminal record, no wild behavior. In short, he was invisible because he lived so plainly. A predator who didn't roar but whispered. The turning point. The first human entry. Experts believed Harold's shift from animals to humans came in the late 1970s. His journals showed increasing frustration with limitations of animal hides. The first human entry, written in 1978, was chillingly simple. Female approx. 19, Quarry Ridge. Compact obtained. First successful preparation. That entry marked the birth of the Skinner. And unlike many killers who spiral into chaos, Harold grew more precise, more controlled with each crime. Ritual and control. The cabin was more than a crime scene. It was his sanctuary. The hooks, the knives, the jars. They were arranged with purpose. as though he were conducting ceremonies. He was not sloppy or impulsive. He was deliberate, almost reverent. One profiler noted the similarities to taxidermy, stretching, tanning, and displaying skins as if they were trophies. But Harold elevated it into something darker, a private museum where the exhibits were lives he had stolen. Why Hollow Creek? Why did Harold never leave? Why remain tethered to one forest for decades? The answer, experts concluded, was control. The woods of Hollow Creek were his hunting ground, his stage. He knew every trail, every bend, every hiding spot. Leaving would mean risk, uncertainty, exposure. By staying, he remained master of a familiar world, a spider in the center of his web. The psychology of silence. Perhaps the most unsettling part of Harold's profile was his ability to remain unnoticed. Unlike killers who crave recognition, Harold thrived in silence. He wanted no headlines, no infamy. His satisfaction came from his journals, his displays, his trophies. Dr. Parson put it bluntly. He didn't need the world to know. He only needed himself to remember. This inward focus is why he survived so long without capture. There were no boasts, no slip-ups, just decades of quiet ritual, hidden in plain sight. The predator defined. By the end of their analysis, investigators concluded Harold Cramer fit a chilling profile. Organized serial killer, careful planning, methodical rituals, lust for preservation, fixation on skinning and cataloging, predatory patience, stalking isolated victims with precision, social camouflage, ordinariness as his shield. He was not a monster from legends, nor a shadowy figure in the woods. He was something more terrifying, an ordinary man whose private world hid unimaginable horrors. Reflection. In the end, the profile of the Skinner wasn't just about understanding Harold. It was about warning others. Predators are not always the ones who stand out. Sometimes they are the ones who fade into the background, who sweep the floors, who nod politely at the grocery store. Harold Cramer was not the creature of Hollow Creek folklore. He was a man. And that reality was far more terrifying than any story whispered around a campfire. When the cabin's horrors were exposed and the journals decoded, one question remained above all. Where was Harold Cramer now? The man who had stalked Hollow Creek for decades was no longer a shadow in the woods. He was flesh and blood, alive, and somewhere out there. From whisper to manhunt, the first step was to confirm Harold's identity. The journals bore his initials, HC, scrawled at the bottom of early pages. Old utility records tied him to a hunting lease near the cabin in the late 1970s. But the most damning connection came from fingerprints lifted off the ledger covers. Prints that matched Harold Cramer, a janitor once employed at the county courthouse. What had been local folklore was now undeniable fact. The Skinner of Hollow Creek was Harold Cramer. A trail of silence. Finding Harold wasn't simple. He hadn't left a clear address in years. Tax records showed his last known residence had been a small trailer on the edge of town, but neighbors said he abandoned it months before the cabin's discovery. He had no active bank accounts, no credit cards, no driver's license renewal. He had done what he always did best, vanish into silence. But investigators knew a predator so tethered to ritual couldn't stray far from his hunting ground. Hollow Creek was his domain. So they began a systematic sweep of the forest, interviewing campers, hunters, even squatters who might have crossed paths with him. Eyewitnesses in the dark. A breakthrough came from a group of teenagers camping near the quarry. They reported seeing an older man 2 weeks earlier, carrying a canvas bag and watching their fire from the tree line. When they called out, he disappeared into the woods. Their description, tall, thin, white hair, gaunt face matched Harold's last known photo. Another tip came from a gas station attendant in a nearby town. She remembered an older man paying cash for kerosene late at night, his hands cracked and dirty, his clothes reeking of the woods. Security cameras confirmed it. Harold was alive, surviving off the grid. The net tightens. The sheriff's department, now working with state police and the FBI, set up motion-triggered cameras along trails, creek crossings, and abandoned cabins. For weeks, the images captured nothing but deer, raccoons, and the occasional hiker. Then one camera near the marsh picked up a figure, tall, hunched, carrying a lantern. The timestamp was 2:13 a.m. The man never looked at the camera, but his profile was unmistakable. The Skinner was still walking his woods. The raid. On a cold November morning, a task force converged. Guided by dogs and drones, they traced Harold's movements deeper into the marsh, where they discovered a makeshift campsite hidden under tarps and branches. Inside were familiar horrors: jars, knives, and bones too fresh to be mistaken for old. But Harold was gone. A trail of footprints led further into the swamp. For 2 days, officers pursued him, wading through knee-deep water, combing through thickets. Searchlights cut the night. Helicopters thundered overhead. The forest that had once been Harold's sanctuary was now alive with the sound of his hunters. The capture. On the third night, a state trooper spotted movement near an abandoned logging shack. Surrounding officers closed in. When they kicked down the door, Harold stood inside, lantern in hand, as if waiting. His knives lay neatly on the table. His journals, what little remained, were stacked beside him. He did not resist. He did not speak. He simply raised his hands, the flicker of the lantern painting deep shadows across his gaunt face. The Skinner of Hollow Creek, the man who had terrorized a community from the shadows for decades, was finally in custody. After the arrest, back at the station, Harold said little during interrogation. Asked why he did it, he shrugged. Asked how many victims there were, he smiled faintly and whispered, "Enough." Investigators pressed him for names, locations, numbers. He offered nothing. For Harold, the journals and the cabin had already spoken for him. In his mind, the ledger was his confession, his masterpiece. Relief and terror. News of his capture spread quickly. Families of victims wept with relief, though some said it was too late. No arrest could undo decades of loss. Others feared there were more like him still out there. Hollow Creek itself became both a crime scene and a symbol, forever marked by the years it had sheltered a predator. Reflection. The hunt for the Skinner showed both his strength and his weakness. He had hidden for decades in plain sight, surviving on silence and invisibility. But in the end, his tether to Hollow Creek betrayed him. He could not leave the woods that had given him control. And so, the manhunt ended where it began. In the shadows of the trees, under the cover of silence, in the forest, he believed would always protect him. The arrest of Harold Cramer ended one chapter of horror, but the trial that followed opened another. For the families of the victims, the courtroom would become both a place of reckoning and of fresh wounds. For investigators, it was the chance to lay out the story they had pieced together from bones, journals, and shadows. And for the town of Hollowbrook, it was the moment when whispered legend became undeniable fact. The courtroom atmosphere. The courthouse overflowed from the first day. News vans lined the square, reporters broadcasting every detail of the Skinner of Hollow Creek to a horrified nation. Inside, the air was taut with grief. On one side sat the families of the missing, clutching photographs of their loved ones. On the other, Harold Cramer sat hunched, pale and gaunt, wearing a plain suit provided by the state. He never looked at the families. He never looked at the jury. He stared only at the desk in front of him, as if the trial were a formality and not his judgment day. The prosecution's case. Led by State Attorney Laura Gaines, the prosecution's strategy was clear. Overwhelm the jury with the sheer weight of evidence. The skull and remains. Forensic experts testified that DNA from bones matched missing persons reports, spanning 3 decades. The ledger. Pages were projected on courtroom screens, each entry aligned with a name and date of a disappearance. Jurors saw words like harvested and displayed, paired with grieving families in the gallery. The cabin. Crime scene photos displayed hooks, knives, and jars. Investigators described the cabin as a private slaughterhouse. The quarry. Archaeologists testified about the mass of remains unearthed, laying out a grim timeline of bodies in the earth. Each day, the evidence stacked higher, painting Harold not as a misunderstood recluse, but as a calculated predator. The families' voices. Perhaps the most emotional moments came when families testified. Michael Harris, brother of Melissa Harris, stood trembling as he held up the locket found around her neck. "Yeah, for decades they told us she ran away," he said, his voice breaking. "But she was here all along. He took her, and he kept her like she was nothing more than a note in his book." Jurors wiped tears. Reporters described the gallery as a place of collective mourning, where grief and rage poured out after years of silence. The defense. Harold's defense attorneys faced an impossible task. They argued the journals could be fantasy, that the remains might not all be linked to him, that contamination at dig sites raised doubts. At one point, they even suggested Harold was a collector of tragedy who gathered relics from old police cases but never committed the murders himself. But the evidence was too strong. The ledger's handwriting matched his. His fingerprints were on the books. Items from victims, eyeglasses, shoes, jewelry, were found in his cabin. The defense's arguments wilted under the weight of fact. Harold on the stand. In a surprising move, Harold insisted on testifying. His demeanor was flat, almost bored. He described himself as a curator, not a killer. "I preserved what would have been forgotten," he told the court. "I gave them permanence." When asked directly if he killed Melissa Harris, Robert Langley, or Elaine Matthews, he paused, then answered with a slight smile. "I obtained them." The courtroom erupted in gasps. The judge struck the remark from record, but the damage was done. His own words had convicted him in the eyes of the jury. The verdict. After 6 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 3 days. On charges of first-degree murder, guilty. On charges of desecration of human remains, guilty. On charges of kidnapping, guilty. As the verdict was read, families wept, clutching each other. Harold sat motionless, his expression unchanged, as though the outcome mattered little. For a man who had lived decades in silence, the judgment of 12 strangers was just another page in his ledger. Sentencing. The judge's words were firm. "You turned human lives into objects. You turned this community into a hunting ground. For these crimes, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." Harold nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging a transaction. Then he was led away, shackles clinking, never to see Hollow Creek again. Aftermath. For the families, the verdict brought some closure, but also lingering pain. Answers had come, but so had fresh images. Photos of bones, of cabins, of journals that reduced loved ones to lines of code. For the town, the trial was a mirror. Hollowbrook could no longer claim its legends were just stories. The Skinner had lived among them for decades, and no one had dared to look too closely. Reflection. The trial of the Skinner proved that monsters do not always live in shadows. Sometimes they sit quietly in plain sight, sweeping floors, nodding politely at the grocery store, waiting for the silence of others to cover their crimes. And in the end, it wasn't just Harold Cramer who stood on trial. It was the silence of a community, the blindness of investigators, and the stories dismissed for too long. When the trial ended and Harold Cramer was locked away for life, many thought Hollowbrook would finally breathe again. But the truth was more complicated. The case of the Skinner had burrowed deep into the town's psyche. His crimes left behind not just bones in the earth, but shadows in the minds of everyone who had ever walked the woods of Hollow Creek. The town that couldn't forget. Hollowbrook had always been a quiet, working-class community, the kind of place where neighbors waved and kids rode bikes until dark. After the Skinner's arrest, that picture was shattered. Parents no longer let children play near the woods. Hunters stopped going out alone. Hikers carried pepper spray and avoided trails near the quarry. One resident put it bluntly. The woods used to be our backyard. Now they're a graveyard. Even years later, the name Hollow Creek conjured not images of fishing or picnics, but whispers of the man who had turned its shadows into his sanctuary. The family's ongoing grief. For the families of the victims, justice was only partial. They had names, they had answers, but they would never have their loved ones back. Melissa Harris's mother kept her daughter's locket, tarnished, bent from years underground, in a small glass case. She told reporters she touched it every morning, both as comfort and as a reminder of the silence that had cost her daughter's life. Michael Harris said the trial gave him closure, but also rage. They said she ran away. They told us to move on. If they had listened sooner, maybe he wouldn't have killed so many. That bitterness lingered. For some, the trial closed wounds. For others, it reopened them. Police under scrutiny. The case also reshaped law enforcement in the county. Critics blasted the sheriff's office for decades of dismissing disappearances as runaways or accidents. A state review panel found systemic negligence in how missing persons cases were handled. As a result, new protocols were introduced. Every missing person would be investigated thoroughly, regardless of age or background. Cold case units were expanded with state funding. Families were given victim advocates to ensure their voices weren't silenced. It was a painful reckoning, but one that many believed could prevent another predator from thriving in silence. The media's obsession. National media descended on Hollowbrook, turning the Skinner into a grim household name. Documentaries aired, podcasts dissected his methods, books were written about the case. While some argued this brought awareness, others saw it as exploitation. Families of victims resented their loved ones being reduced to episodes in a true crime binge. One grieving father said, "They talk about him like he's a character. He's not a character. He's the reason my daughter is in the ground." The debate highlighted a broader cultural question. How do we tell stories of horror without glorifying the monster? The woods themselves, Hollow Creek, remained scarred. After the excavations, the forest floor was pocked with flagged sites and shallow pits. Some wanted the land bulldozed and turned into something else, a park, a memorial. Others wanted it sealed, left untouched, as though disturbing it further would awaken more horrors. In the end, the county declared part of the area a protected site. A memorial stone was placed at the trailhead, inscribed with the words, "For those lost to silence, may they never be forgotten." The fear that spread. The Skinners' crimes didn't just haunt Hollowbrook, they echoed nationwide. Parents became more wary of unsolved disappearances. Lawmakers cited the case when pushing for stricter missing persons protocols. Criminology students studied Harold's journals as examples of organized predation. But perhaps the most chilling effect was psychological. If a man like Harold could live undetected for decades in a small town, how many others might be out there, hiding behind ordinary faces, waiting in the shadows of other forgotten woods? A community changed. Over time, Hollowbrook rebuilt, but it was never the same. Candlelight vigils became annual events where names of victims were read aloud. Survivors' families found strength in community, but also lived with permanent scars. The children who grew up during the trial carried that fear into adulthood. Some left town altogether, unable to live in the place that had been a predator's hunting ground. Others stayed, determined to reclaim Hollow Creek from its dark past. Reflection. The legacy of the Skinner is not just in the bones unearthed or the journals he left behind. It is in the silence that enabled him, the families who were ignored, the shadows that still linger in Hollowbrook. His crimes taught the world a brutal lesson. Monsters are not always strangers. Sometimes they are the neighbor who nods politely, the janitor sweeping the floor, the quiet man who vanishes into the woods. For Hollowbrook, the name Skinner of Hollow Creek will forever be carved into memory, not as legend, but as lived nightmare. The verdict had been delivered. The monster was behind bars. The families had their answers, at least the ones investigators could give. But as the years passed, it became clear that the story of the Skinner of Hollow Creek was not truly finished. Too many bones had no names. Too many entries in the ledger were still unsolved codes. Too many questions lingered in the silence Harold left behind. The unnamed victims. For every victim identified through DNA, there were remains that yielded nothing conclusive. Teeth without records. Bones too degraded for comparison. In the journals, entire entries referred only to F-20s or M-30s. Who were they? Where had they come from? Families of missing persons from across the state and beyond contacted investigators, hoping against hope that their loved one's fate lay in those woods. Some found closure, many did not. The unanswered names became a second shadow, not just the lives Harold had taken, but the identities he had erased forever. The ledger's gaps. The journals stopped abruptly in 2003, but investigators weren't sure that meant Harold stopped killing. Some believed there were missing volumes, perhaps hidden or destroyed before his capture. A gap of nearly 2 years existed between entries, a silence that experts felt was unnatural for someone so meticulous. One profiler noted, "Killers like Harold don't simply stop. If he ceased writing, it wasn't because he stopped killing. It was because he didn't want those killings remembered." That chilling thought left open the possibility that more victims lay beyond Hollow Creek, unconnected, undiscovered. The man behind the silence. Even in prison, Harold remained a cipher. He refused interviews, declined to speak at parole hearings, and ignored letters from journalists and criminologists alike. Guards described him as quiet, polite, almost unnervingly ordinary. When asked by a prison psychiatrist why he never revealed the number of victims, Harold allegedly smiled faintly and said only, "The forest knows." Isn't that enough? The phrase became infamous, quoted in documentaries and articles. A final taunt from a man who had always hidden in silence. A community haunted. Hollowbrook tried to heal, but the questions weighed heavy. The forest remained both a place of beauty and dread. Parents still warned their children not to wander too far into the trees. Hunters still paused at the quarry, remembering the shallow graves unearthed there. The town's identity became tied to the Skinner. Every mention of Hollow Creek now followed by a pause, a whisper of the horrors once hidden in its shadows. The cultural echo. The Skinner's case left ripples far beyond Hollowbrook. True crime media dissected his methods. Universities studied his journals. Law enforcement agencies cited him as a case study in how predators can thrive in silence when communities dismiss the vulnerable. But in telling his story, another risk arose. Fascination. Some collectors of murderabilia sought to obtain copies of his ledger pages, treating them as trophies in their own twisted way. Families of victims condemned this, fighting to ensure the journals remained sealed in evidence archives. Their fear was that Harold's collection would inspire others, that his obsession would outlive him. The shadows that linger. Even after his death in prison in 2019, Harold's shadow remained. Rumors persisted of other cabins in other woods. Journalists dug into his janitorial years, speculating that he may have used access to files and buildings to stalk victims outside Hollowbrook. None of these claims were ever proven, but the doubt gnawed at the edges of closure. How many bones still lay hidden in forests elsewhere? How many victims would never be found? Reflection. The Skinner of Hollow Creek left behind more than a trail of horror. He left questions that may never be answered. He showed the world that monsters thrive not only in shadows, but in silence. The silence of communities unwilling to see, of systems quick to dismiss, of people who tell themselves legends are just stories. In the end, Harold Cramer was just a man. No supernatural power, no otherworldly force, only patience, cruelty, and a chilling need to preserve what he destroyed. And perhaps that is the most terrifying truth of all, that ordinary men can carry extraordinary darkness hidden behind ordinary faces. Closing. The cabin is gone now, torn down after the trial. A memorial stone stands at the trailhead, etched with the words, "For the lost, the unnamed, the forgotten." May their voices echo louder than silence. But as the sun sets over Hollow Creek and the woods grow dark, the questions remain. How many victims still lie beneath the soil? How many entries in the ledger were never written? How many shadows still keep their secrets? The Skinner is gone. The fear is not.